everybody, and good evening to Professor Shankar. Thank you very much for joining us for today's webinar, ТIṇai as Alternative Social Order, convened by Sahapedia, the online encyclopedic resource on the arts, cultures, and histories of South Asia. This webinar is part of a series on nature in the Indian imaginary, whose roots go back to a project on mapping Bhakti and Sufi traditions in India, which is supported by Bajaj Autos, where we try to explore through conversations with scholars, practitioners, and lay people what bonding with God has meant in different times and places, and to document the creative expressions it has inspired and the stories associated with sites and festivities. The pandemic led us to take some of these ideas in a new direction, and we started a series of online interviews and discussions on how conceptions of the natural world and cosmology relate to ideas of the sacred. In May, we held a webinar on Hanuman and how he might be interpreted as a lord of ecology, where Professor Philip Ludgendorff was in conversation with Professor Neeta Kumar. And in July, we hosted a panel discussion on an Indian ecological philosophy, in which Professor Purushottama Bilamoria, Dr. Meera Bendu, and Dr. Asim Srivastav participated. Today, we're delighted to have with us Professor Nirmal Selvamony, who will be in conversation with Professor S. Shankar on the idea of the ТиНai in classical Tamil literature, or the division of the world into 5 habitable regions: mountains, grassland, desert, riverine plains, and the seacoast, each associated with a particular way of life. Professor Selvamony has been studying the ТиНai for 4 decades and has shown how it represents not merely a poetic convention, but a social order from which we can learn much today. Many of you would be aware of Professor Selvamony's work, and Professor Shankar will be introducing it more fully. But by way of a brief introduction, he is former professor and head of the Department of English Studies and Dean of the School of Social Sciences and Humanities at the Central University of Tamil Nadu. He also taught English at the Madras Christian College for 28 years. He has published 9 books and more than 50 book chapters and as many journal articles, and presented hundreds in the early 1980s that he started a discussion group on the ТиНai, which launched the ТиНai social movement. He's introduced an eco-criticism course in India and founded the Indian Journal of Ecocriticism. He's formulated the theory of neo-tiNai poiesis and revived the philosophy of ТиНai society and introduced a new area of study, ТиНai musicology. And he's also scripted and directed plays and played the guitar in professional bands. And we're delighted to welcome Professor Shankar, who is a novelist and critic and chair of the English department at the University of Hawaii. He is the author of 3 novels and 2 volumes of criticism on translation and issues of caste and on colonialism and modernity, and a collection of poems. And I believe his play is also under production or has been produced recently, his first play. His most recent book is the novel Ghost in the Tamarind, on intercaste love story set in Tamil Nadu. He will be speaking to Professor Selvamony about the development of his thinking on the ТиНai and its interplay with his on-ground and creative work. The 2 speakers will be in conversation for an hour, after which we will have a 5-minute break before we open it to the floor. Please type in your questions for the speakers in the chat box, and my colleague Karthikeya will read them out to the speakers. You're also requested to keep your mics on mute throughout the session. Thank you very much. Over to you, Professor Shankar.
Thank you to everybody. Thank you to Sahapedia for asking me to do this conversation, to have this conversation with my very dear friend and teacher, Nirmal Selvamony, and it's a great pleasure to see him on the screen. I was going to travel back to India during the summer, and of course the pandemic put a stop to that, but whenever I'm back in Chennai, Nirmal and I always get together and share work and ideas and conversation. And since I did not manage to do that by actually traveling back to India, I'm very happy that we can do a version of this here online. I've known Nirmal since 1984 when I joined Madras Christian College to do a master's in English. And Nirmal was a professor there. He had joined in 1982. And he had been a student in Madras Christian College previously during the 70s. And so I got to know him there. I took classes with him and also had many wonderful conversations with him outside of class. And then we became friends where after I finished my master's and moved to the US to do a PhD and have stayed in conversation over, over, over many decades now, since 1984. There were a very terrific group of professors at Madras Christian College. It was a really quite enriching experience to be there in the mid 80s. And Nirmal, I think, was one of those very terrific professors. So I have a lot of gratitude and appreciation for everything that I've learned from Nirmal and for our conversations over time. Nirmal taught in a department of English for many, many years, for many decades. But as you can already tell from the introduction which was given of him, he's also a really, aside from being a scholar of English literature, he's a very learned, very profound scholar of classical Tamil literature and music and philosophy and grammar and many other things, as will become clear in this conversation. And it'd be good for us to keep those two things in mind as we go through this conversation. I think one of the things that I really appreciated about Nirmal over time is the very unorthodox, very unconventional in all the best ways nature of his work. It moves in many different directions. It's very challenging. And I think that's partly because he straddles so many fields, from sort of English studies within India, a very profound knowledge and scholarship in Tamil, in musicology, in ethnomusicology, aside from being a very creative person himself. Nirmal is from the southern part of Tamil Nadu, sort of the Kanyakumari, Tirunelveli area, which I'm from, or my family's from. I don't know what it means to say that I'm from it. I'm certainly very aware of it and have traveled back there a lot. And Nirmal and I have talked about that as well. And I mentioned this because if you know the Tirunelveli, Kanyakumari area well, then you might see, and if you read Nirmal's work, I think you'll see some appreciation for the way in which he talks about land. Anyway, maybe I'm being sentimental. Maybe it's every part of the world has that same sense, but I'm able to sort of relate to many of the things that he talks about because of my knowledge of that part of India. Nirmal has also lived in Chennai, of course, for most of his life. And I mentioned this because I think a running theme in his work is this desire to really think about industrialism, urbanism, and its modernity, the state society. These are some of the things that he's kind of wrestling with in his work. And I think Tiṇai, what we're going to be talking about today, is very central to the way in which he's thinking about it. And maybe I'll say a little bit more about that before I stop and we begin the conversation. But the main thing here I'm trying to get at is this sort of tension, between what he sometimes calls in his writings primal society, and I want to ask Nirmal more to talk about that some more, and state society, right? With the distinction between primal society and state society, and all the different things which are associated with primal society and state society. I think Tiṇai is a way for Nirmal to sort of clarify that relationship and maybe to ask us to think critically about, sort of industrial, state, urban life. Nirmal has written on art, on literature, on criticism and theory, and on philosophy. One of the things we do trade work now and then, and one of the things that one of Nirmal's recent works, I don't know if it's out and published yet or not, is maybe, I read it earlier this year, are two wonderful essays on logic in classical Indian philosophy. So I think he's very interested in very philosophical, themes and ideas. I won't call him a philosopher because he's much more than that, but there certainly is a very profound philosophical theme in his work. In 2009, Nirmal visited the University of Hawaii to, I had organized a conference on ecocriticism in South Asia, and Nirmal was one of the invited guests among maybe another 3 or 4 people who in a larger conference, which had lots of panels and things like that. And I mentioned this because Nirmal, in my conversation with Nirmal, as we were kind of going over what he might do, I wanted him to do, of course, a lecture, a public lecture, which he did. And then he also did, as an evening cultural event, a musical performance in which he played the electric guitar and sang 4 or 5 songs, Tamil classical songs, as he interpreted them to illustrate his ideas about Tiṇai. So, I mean, he is able to do that. He's able to give you an erudite lecture on a topic, and then he's able to say, the same evening, he's able to play music and perform these songs, and then take us through with PowerPoint slides. And so it was a really wonderful event, very engaging, and brought a different kind of an audience because, they came to listen to the music and to sort of learn about this idea. So he's also interested in something which, and this is something which I'm beginning to see more of in Nirmal's work in more recent years, and this is again a question that I might ask him during the conversation, is this term indigeneity, right? So the indigenous and indigeneity, and this of course has become, at least certainly in the US and in Hawaii especially, where there's an extraordinarily powerful and rich tradition of thinking about the indigenous and indigeneity because of the continuation of pre-colonial Hawaiian ideas and cultural expression into the 21st century. So what does indigenous mean? What is indigeneity? Why is there this return to indigeneity? And in what way does the idea of Tiṇai, or the kinds of societies and cultural formations that Nirmal is engaging, reviving, asking us to think about, how does it connect to these, this renewed interest in the indigenous, right? Nirmal has written a lot, as the introduction made very clear. I'm going to mention maybe 4 or 5 themes, and I've already touched on them, but I'm going to mention 4 or 5 themes with the idea of Tiṇai specifically in mind, because that's going to be the topic of the conversation. So the first, these are publications or themes or terms, just to kind of orient us as we go through the conversation. First, I'll mention the book, which was Nirmal's dissertation for his PhD, Persona in Tolkappiyam, which explores that classical Tamil text from the specific perspective of the persona. And I'll ask Nirmal to maybe say a little bit more about that in the conversation. But I think in that book, you have a kind of a summation of Nirmal's ideas about Tiṇai and his own very specific and in some ways idiosyncratic intervention in the debates about classical Tamil literature. I'm not a scholar of, I should be very clear, I'm not a scholar of classical Tamil literature by any means. So I'm very much speaking as a bystander to those debates, but it's always seemed to me that maybe Nirmal is a little, sort of coming into it at a kind of a tangent in a very productive and important way. His founding and editing of the journal called Tiṇai, in which some of his essays are collected, and writings by other people also, which was a kind of a sustained effort to do some thinking about Tiṇai over a number of years. What has already been mentioned, his teaching of a variety of courses to do with Tiṇai in various institutions. And here, and because Nirmal shared with me a kind of as we were preparing for this interview, we went back and forth, and he shared some details about the way in which he had come to be thinking about Tiṇai. And I was struck by the way in which he moves from teaching a course called Tamil Poetics at Madras Christian College, which then becomes eco-criticism. And then later on in his writing, certainly, he begins to think about the relationship between eco-criticism and Tiṇai. So I want to sort of think about what those transitions are, to go from Tamil Poetics to a course in eco-criticism, to then start thinking about Tiṇai as eco-criticism, and in what ways it actually fits with our contemporary understanding of what eco-criticism is, and in what ways it might depart. I mean, this is a conversation to have with Nirmal. He founded an organization called OSLE, Organization for the Study of Literature and Environment, and which held many wonderful conferences, a couple of which I attended, which was an attempt to bring scholars together to think collectively about the relationship between literature and environment. And maybe finally, I'll mention this term, which again, is in Nirmal's work going back decades really, and which he seems to not want to let go of, and that's values education, right? So he uses this term values education, that he's interested in a values education. And I think Tiṇai is very much part of his desire for us as teachers, students, writers, scholars to be thinking about values education. And I might want to ask him, we'll see how the conversation proceeds, but it might be something to kind of really think about. What is values education for Nirmal? How is Tiṇai values education? And what does it mean to engage in values education in 2020? Maybe in the context of a pandemic, right? So, I mean, this is completely fortuitous, but maybe there's an opportunity here to kind of think about Tiṇai and values education in the context of the pandemic. If I've given you a sense of Nirmal as a profoundly idealistic, profoundly contrarian, right? He and I don't agree on everything, and we've had sort of arguments about some of the things that we don't agree about, very friendly, very respectful arguments. But if I've given you a sense of him as a profoundly contrarian and profoundly anti-modernist, I don't know whether he will agree with me on this, but as a profoundly anti-modernist critic and thinker, then I think I will stop there, because maybe that's a good point to move into the conversation. It's an honor and a pleasure to hold this conversation with Nirmal, who's my friend and my teacher. Yeah. So that was my sort of opening observations. And maybe the right way to begin, Nirmal, is for me to ask you what seems to me an extremely obvious question, but also a question whose answer I want to hear, despite my having read a great many of the things you've written. A question it'll be useful for everybody to hear, and for me as well, is what is Tiṇai to you?
Eco-regional society of humans and non-humans.
Okay, yeah. You say a little bit more about the way in which you think about Tiṇai and where you're getting those ideas from? What is the sort of maybe the body of works that, yeah.
So I want to thank Sahapedia for inviting me to share my views on Tiṇai with many, many listeners today. Especially want to thank Ms. Niharika Gupta, Mr. Karthikeya, and Ms. Sonia. Also, thank you very much, Shankar, for saying very nice things about me, which I probably don't deserve. I also want to thank all these listeners, who are willing to spare their time to be part of this conversation. I'd like to actually begin with an anecdote. In 2007, a Tamil magazine, Tiṇai, interviewed me on Tiṇai and published it in their December issue. Within a few days of the publication, I was pleasantly surprised to receive a long letter from a well-known Tamil writer and scholar, Kovai ஞானி, who passed away recently. He was persuaded to write this letter to me after he had read about my idea of Tiṇai that I had expressed in the Tiṇai interview. In that letter, he said, so far many had seen Tiṇai as something that is exclusively literary, but you seem to think that it can be used at many other levels, like the economic and political. And this is a new perspective. So this new perspective that ஞானி talks about is what I would call the alternative social order perspective. It's new because ஞானி, as ஞாnி rightly says, it was mainly thought of as a kind of a literary theory or probably a device. It's true that some scholars like Raghava Iyengar P.G. Srinivas Iyengar and Sivathambi, had seen it as a life way earlier, but none had seen Tiṇai as a possible alternative to either the caste society or the industrial society. Also, Tiṇai to most people was a thing of the past, primarily, a literary theory, as I said. But such an approach to Tiṇai was challenged by the group, I founded in the early 80s. The activities and intellectual achievements of that group and its later subgroups have prompted, I think, several people to think about the possibility of seeing Tiṇai as an alternative social order. Despite the absence of considerable assent for regarding Tiṇai that way, the Tiṇai movement has created, I think, a social energy, which is a kind of necessary condition, if you would agree, for the social change that the Tiṇai group envisages. Even those who are not sure that the future should be Tiṇai are sometimes found encouraging Tiṇai or experimenting with it in some way or the other. For example, those who trace their origin to Tiṇai community, like the Devendra Kulabeyarar, or adopt Tiṇai names in modern contexts, or favor Tiṇai food such as millets to rice or wheat, or a cultural recreation center that displays the Tiṇai diorama, or a research organization that raises Tiṇai plants in separate plots of land for probably research, or even a government that wants to create genetic parks to preserve the gene pool of the Tiṇai flora, may not be ready to give up the industrialist life way and adopt the Tiṇai life way. Comfortably ensconced in industrialism, they may just want to toy with Tiṇai now and then. Aren't the woods lovely, dark, and deep until you are not a woodlander yourself? But even when a feature of Tiṇai is only a fancy or diversion or an experiment, thankfully, I think social change happens. Even agnostics contribute to the overall change. In fact, even in a social movement that believes in public protest, not all participate with the same degree of conviction, do they? If a social movement is something that moves towards the goal of a particular social change, Tiṇai is certainly one. Those who are part of this movement do not involve in direct action, but they express their desire in diverse ways: discussion, performance, research, writing, or some form of Tiṇai practice or the other, some of which I mentioned. Though the final goal of Tiṇai movement is not any one of these in isolation, each of these will hopefully contribute to the realization of the final goal, namely the whole social order. We know that there are different models of alternative life way. Some of these are religious, while others are secular, and yet others are just fictions or fantasies. Now, religious life ways are problematic because the life way recommended by one religious group may not be acceptable to another. Secular models are not compatible with Tiṇai because the supernatural is a vital part of Tiṇai, and fictional life ways represented in verbal or visual narratives have not been time-tested ones. In order to come up with a model of the Tiṇai life way, I primarily relied on Tolkappiyam and Sangam songs because the primal social features are best depicted therein. I've also am indebted to cultures other than Tamil for either understanding Tiṇai entities better or for illuminating what was swathed in darkness for ages. For example, the ancient Tamil Tiṇai cultural practice, Teyyam, was in evidence in Kerala, which was known as Veriyattu in ancient Tamil. What the Tamil scholar Sami wrote about this Veriyattu, this Teyyam, after watching a performance in Kerala, really was an eye-opener to me because I could learn so much about Kalam and about Tiṇai drama from his description. As Tiṇai societies are found all over the world, the features of the primal societies in other parts of the world could also throw light on Tamil Tiṇai phenomena. For example, a grass skirt from Papua New Guinea, which my parents brought from me from there, helped me understand the Tamil Tiṇai, the Thalai Udai, which is described in Sangam literature. or the grass skirt, Tiṇai's grass skirt. An introduction to the talking drum of the African countries in a world music class I audited at Davidson College in the US helped me see the Tamil Parai was in fact a talking drum, like in some of the African countries and the Southeast Asian countries. But that idea that it was a talking drum was not there in the commentaries, in the glosses that critics provided. So if I had not seen the non-Tamil entity, I would not have come up with a new understanding that I did come up with. So these and other related experiences have actually led me to conclude that some of the ancient Tiṇai elements were much better preserved in cultures other than Tamil. Sometimes even without any comparable objects like these that I mentioned, it's also possible to arrive at an understanding of the true nature of the Tiṇai entity. Such arrival is probably an inexplicable connecting of the dots, shall I say. For example, the term Karchi was nowhere glossed as philosophy, nor Kandi as a type of syllogism, either in the original Tamil text or in the commentaries of them. There is no guarantee that reading all the available information and thinking through them will lead you to connect the dots with regard to either Karchi or Kandi. The connection somehow happens. Though I had been aided by the information provided by some Western scholars, I've always tried to, find the meaning of, the Tiṇai entities as they were in that society. For example, William Johnson Everett's lectures on the oikos and Max Stackhouse's on social ethics helped me a great deal to understand, Tiṇai better. The Greek oikos is not the same as Tiṇai, but Everett's clear and detailed description of it helped me understand Tiṇai as a household better. Similarly, the human society discussed in sociology is not the same as the society in Tiṇai, but Stackhouse's accounts of the human society enabled me to see Tiṇai better as a set of institutions, an approach which was absent in Tamil scholarship then.
Professor Selvamony, you've been muted somehow. So
sorry, I probably did it automatically. Sorry about that. Well, I was talking about the method of working on this Tiṇai. So yet another word is the Tamil word, which helps you open up the doors to understand the indigenous meaning. So I was citing the example of the word Karchi, which has been the key to unlock the indigenous understanding of Tiṇai philosophy. In this, I have resisted the temptation to rely on definitions of philosophy from the West and post-Tiṇai Tamil traditions like materialism and Saivism. I've steered clear of the representations of Tiṇai philosophy in the light of humanism or Marxism or any other post-Tiṇai non-Tamil philosophical traditions. Indeed, all the specifics and nitty-gritty of Tiṇai social order have not been worked out, and probably they never will be. What we now have is a framework of theory and principles of Tiṇai as alternative social order, which will be the basis for diverse practices in different contexts. When implemented, specifics of Tiṇai are likely to have contextual variations. Therefore, those do not fall within the scope of the Tiṇai project. Thank you.
That's a wonderful introduction. I think there are a lot of ideas there. Maybe before we move on to some of the other questions, which I want to have, sort of hear your thoughts on, maybe we can just pick up on a couple of, and I'm trying to see that I'm going to questions which to my mind, both respect the sort of ancient foundations of Tiṇai and respect, honor what I think you are very much trying to do is to demonstrate its contemporary relevance, right? That this is important now, that it tells us something about our society now, that it's not just, as A.K. Ramanujan perhaps most famously in English talked about as Tiṇai as a kind of a literary device, that you can find in Sangam poetry and so on and so forth, but that there is a philosophical basis there. So let me just pick up on two or three terms that you used in your introduction, and have you maybe expand on it. And one is industrial society, right? Industrial society, and maybe I want to hear from you the ways in which Tiṇai, what does Tiṇai have to say about industrial society?
Probably it doesn't say anything about industrial society.
Or what do you want to say about industrial society in Tiṇai? How's
right.
that?
Right. Well, I want to start with what Tiṇai basically is, so that we can get to this point of discussion of the industrial society. So I was telling you, it's a type of eco-regional society of humans and non-humans. It's really about the relationship between them. But let me just explain that a little bit. So in the introduction, Sahapedia introduction, Ms. Niharika Gupta was telling us about the land areas on which these human lifeways are based. So this is very important, and these are not just peculiar to Tamil Nadu as such, but as Tolkien clearly tells us, this is how the entire surface of the earth is divided into, and this very much kind of coincides with the science tells us about the idea of biome. So each of these ecoregion has its own flora, fauna, and human communities, and the typical kind of culture that evolved from that ecoregion. So typologically, if you look at Mullai Tiṇai, it includes all kinds of scrubland, what you call the temperate varieties, like the pampas, veldt in South Africa, the prairies in North America, the steppe in Eurasia, or the tropical, scrublands like the savanna, or in African countries, Brazil, and also the tropical dry green evergreen forests like the TDF in the southern coast of India. So all of these would be different types of mullai. So we need to think of these ecoregions in a very larger sense. So I would say I'm actually talking about Tiṇai-like societies rather than Tiṇai societies here, because it might be confused with the real Tiṇai society which existed, thousands of years ago. So in this conversation, I'm mostly talking about Tiṇai-like society, drawing, ideas about Tiṇai society. So it did not disappear, I think, wholly with the emergence of the state society, because even today, we find a lot of primal societies existing alongside highly industrialized state societies. But we can tell the radical difference between the two. And I think this is probably the heart of the matter. I mean, the answer that Shankar was kind of at the relationship between the humans and the non-humans, or if you want to think of humans and the ecosystem, that's all right too. So the life way of the primal people is largely in tune with the ecosystem, whereas the life way of the state societies, even highly industrialized state societies like ours, it either ignores, the ecosystem or exploits it, or sometimes even destroys it.
Right.
So,
Right.
Talking about the social institutions of Tiṇai societies, like family, subsistence, governance, communication, of all of these, I think family is probably the most basic one, because Tiṇai itself means family. It is such because it embodies the nature of Tiṇai in a way that no other institution does. In fact, one of the meanings, as I told you, is family. So family is a kind of school, shall I say, where the human and the non-human members learn to love one another. In our industrial society, the non-human beings are not part of the family, and also they are dominated or exploited and even destroyed, because our family is an anthropocentric institution in the sense that it doesn't include the non-humans, and love is not the uniting force on many occasions. So if we make the broken family whole, the broken non-human world will flourish again. And Watson Solomon has expressed this idea in one of his latest poems, Corona Quarantine. I just want to read those couple of lines. He says, the broken oikos must become a feign, and nature will heal herself by and by. So we want to think about, Tiṇai as a society, like we need to talk about some of the basic principles which undergird such a society.
So Nirmal,
Sure.
Yeah. So I mean, it occurs to me that here, there is a sort of a parallel to the way in which a lot of indigenous criticism talks about genealogy. Genealogy is a relationship between human beings and non-human living things as well as non-living things, and what you're really trying to get at through the idea of Tiṇai, which you recognize from your reading of these texts go back nearly 1,000 years, is that sort of relationship which is a kind of a broken whole. I wanted to ask you about a term that you use in Persona and Tolkapian, which is your book, which is very important for you, and it's sort of, I think it's central to your understanding of Tiṇai, is conduct. You read Tiṇai as not simply, landscape, not simply in all the other ways, but you emphasize the fact that one of the ways in which to understand Tiṇai is as conduct, right, as human conduct. And I think that seems to be what you're sort of getting at there too, is that it's about the way in which human beings conduct themselves in this environment. So maybe could I ask you to maybe expand on that a little bit? Why conduct is so important for you?
Yeah. Let me go back to the word Tiṇai. I think I need to get into the etymology here. I think it derives from the word Inai. Tamil words can be, get formed from verbal bases with consonants acting as, prothetic elements. So with the consonant ta, the word verbal base Inai, they combine to give you the word Tiṇai. So this Inai is so many things. It can mean spouses, it can mean verbally to join, but it's also one of the four tonal relations in musicology. So Inai is the combination of the tonic and the fifth pitch. So when these two pitches combine, that combination is Inai. Like, for example, sa and pa in an octave. Any other combination of pitches in an octave will not give you, this kind of harmony, the kind of harmony that Inai can produce. Well, you have the possibility of the unison, the first and the eighth degree, in the octave, but that's just, sameness. Whereas if you take, the Inai, which is the tonic and the fifth, there is both unity, almost even probably sameness, or if you like, oneness, and also difference. So sa and pa don't dissolve into an oneness, but they remain sa and pa in the Inai combination. In fact, this is the basic, these are the basic pitches in Indian music, and see most of the instruments, using these two pitches, and a perfectly tuned instrument will sound, will make a sound in which you cannot probably distinguish the two. They sound almost like a single pitch. That kind of a combination is called Inai because that's the kind of harmony that the spouses can produce, which no other combination can produce. So Tiṇai as conduct is something like the kind of relation that Inai suggests. That sort of a relation is what I think Tiṇai suggests as conduct, and that kind of relation is possible only in love. And love is the paradigmatic expression of love in, Tiṇai literature is, the spouses. It's where you find it, best expressed among the spouses, between the spouses. So that is probably how I would like to understand conduct. I mean, as the ideal kind of conduct that Tiṇai envisages.
Okay. Maybe this is a good point at which to ask you about, sort of this running terminology and theme in your work, and which you mentioned already, I think, a couple of times, and I certainly wanted to hear more about, is the value orientation of Tiṇai. I think we've sort of touched on those things. So maybe, the way in which it's different than industrial society, the way in which it offers a certain kind of harmonious conduct, and it sort of, in your reading at any rate, invites a certain kind of harmonious conduct, which I take you to mean includes on the model of the family, but not the sort of the nuclear family of modern times, but a family which includes animals and trees and land and soil and water and everything. I hope that's clear to everybody, that you really are sort of, offering an idea of family, which is not just, father, mother, and two children, not the family planning family, but, so there's a much more kind of expanded idea. So I think we have some sort of indications of what values you find in Tiṇai in thinking about contemporary society. So maybe two questions for you. One is value orientation. Why is that important, right? Why is it important in the present context for us to really have what you seem to value a lot? No pun intended, but value orientation. So, I mean, maybe I'd like to hear a little bit. And then maybe a kind of a sub-question there, and you can take it in whichever order you like, is also caste society. I mean, you said that Tiṇai society is not caste society, and I've heard you say that to me in conversation before. And so maybe two questions, which may or may not be related in your mind, but I'm going to post both of them to you at the same time. One is, why is value orientation important? And secondly, maybe a kind of a part of the conversation, in thinking about industrial society and non-industrial society, what does Tiṇai have to say about caste society?
Yeah, thank you, Shankar. Now, I want to start with this word value because that's an English word that I'm using to communicate something that's not in English. So people who translate, value in Tamil use words like takavu or madipu or something like that, but that's not really what I have in mind. What I have in mind is something like mudat porul. For example, inbam porul aran, something like the Purusharthas in Sanskrit, So that is what, I call value here. Those are basic values. And the most fundamental value, that undergirds even these mudat porul, like happiness or inbam, porul or substance, and aram or ethicality. So what underlies all these three is anbu or love. Now, both the social order and the conduct of the individual agents, whether they're human or non-human, they're based on this. So what is love? What is anbu? How do we understand that? I mean, to put it in a very, briefly, it's a kind of selfless action for the well-being of the other, if that makes sense. Such action is the normative one in all the Tiṇai social institutions, and particularly family, I was telling you a while ago. Now, this selflessness doesn't mean self-annihilation, but it's putting the interests of the other, first, and giving priority to the well-being of the other. And this also is self-realization. Self-realization is a word that is used in discourses that are religious or even self-improvement, discourse. You find this word, in which very often it is, in my understanding, a kind of technology of the self. Technology or engineering, is what I would call in Tamil vilayadal. That's, roughly the equivalent would be the game, the word game in English, a sort of act in which the rational is predominant. In such acts, there is no spontaneity, which is a precondition for play or ardor, um, which is the basis of unbelief or love. Simply put, you do not engineer a selfless act. The kind of act that we are talking about is social, which involves the other. So in such acts, you will have to allow for the spontaneity and the playfulness of the other. If you don't, you are dominant, and probably you're getting even oppressing the other. So the other in Tiṇai is not, I should say, a distant one, but primarily one that's immediate, part of your present context,
So
which I would call.
So would you say that contemporary society is valueless or deficient in value? Is there a gap or an absence that you're trying to fill in Tiṇai and your understanding of Tiṇai as having a value orientation?
Yeah, well, I'm sure, we agree that we are sort of generalizing, and much of what I'm doing is theory, so generalization is inevitable. While describing the industrial social order, always, try to say that it's it's a kind of a market-oriented society where, economy kind of predominates, every other social institutions. That's the most important thing, which the, COVID pandemic is also, kind of eminently proving, that sort of an assumption. So values certainly are not the priority of the society as such, the social structure as such. It may be the priority of certain people, but I don't think, this structure really puts so much premium on values. So, generally, ethics probably, takes the backseat these days, I think. When you bring up ethical issues, they are not really very tasteful. And you're always kind of, stepping on somebody's toes when you sort of get into a discussion of ethics. So that itself clearly shows, I think, if not anything else, that that is not the priority of people. And you probably want to talk about measurable, quantifiable things like, efficiency or, amount of work that's done, even, valuing teachers like the API score that we all talk about, all of these things, I think eminently show that values certainly are not prioritized. This is probably one of the reasons why Ananias had to formulate deep ecology. That's how he diverged from ecology, that's the Ernst Haeckel's idea of ecology. So I think, it's in our societies, certainly, there are values which individual people have as their goals, but I think as a structure, it's lacking.
Okay. I've looked at my watch, and this has been such an interesting conversation that I realized we have about 10 minutes left and 15 things to cover. So I want to go to two things which I feel that we must absolutely touch on, and I really would like to hear your thoughts on, because I think it shows the resonance of your work. And that is to ask you to think maybe a little bit more systematically about the relationship between Tiṇai and eco-criticism, and which you mentioned, it's sort of, been references to it. But I wonder whether it would be useful for our audience to get a sense of what your relationship to eco-criticism, environmental criticism, again, I'm thinking about the sort of academic field, which is more than academic, but trying to sort of get a sense from you of the sort of intervention that thinking about Tiṇai makes in that field. And where you maybe see yourself in agreement with some of the aims of eco-criticism, and where you might see yourself in disagreement or in departing from. So if you could maybe spend 3 or 4 minutes on that, and then with your indulgence, I might jump in because when we have about 5 minutes left, I have another really crucial question for you.
Okay, thanks, Shankar. I want to start with two histories of eco-criticism. One is the history of the American eco-criticism. As a field, which is named eco-criticism, it begins in the US in the 1970s with Joseph Meeker's work, Comedy of Survival. But then later, William Ruckert calls it eco-criticism. And then it becomes an academic discipline in 1989, I think, when Cheryl Glotfelty started teaching it at the University of Nevada at Reno. Now that's a very well-known history of eco-criticism. But there is an untold history of eco-criticism, another history. Now the first eco-critical course that started in India was not called eco-criticism, but it was called Tamil Poetics. It is now seen as an eco-criticism course because it was just really based on Tiṇai. And it was a course that introduced the Tiṇai theory and encouraged students to see how, that's kind of exemplified in different texts from not only from Tamil Nadu, from other parts of the world as well. And not only that history of the course, but also, the theory that this course kind of generated. Earlier, we called it Poetics because I started it in the English department, and the English department people are not familiar with Tiṇai, so use something Greek, that's, even though you don't probably, understand it very well, somehow you can connect with it. So we used the name Poetics in the beginning, but then after Tiṇai gained currency all over the world, scholars from other parts of the world also started talking about it. Tiṇai gets translated into Chinese and all of that. So that encouraged me to, call this theory by name Tiṇai, and Shankar has played a very important role in the change of this name. So he was constantly telling me, why call this oikos? So now, it's called neo-tiNai poetics. So, and this history, is very seldom talked about, especially, in general descriptions of eco-criticism. If you open up the internet, you are not likely to see this history very much. They probably might talk about Osley, India, but then, how, the Indian eco-criticism, precedes the American eco-criticism by some years. And how, this new theory challenges the American, definition of eco-criticism itself, that is seldom talked about.
And how,
I think,
what is the nature of the challenge?
And well, that's what, I'm kind of put my finger on it in a while. This is probably a strong way of putting it, but there's some kind of subalternization of it. Not only, by scholars outside of India, but also Indian scholars, and that you might see it as a kind of colonial attitude, a sort of prostration before the West, if you like, so that is one thing that maybe I just want to end it there. But then why is, this Indian eco-criticism is not really taking off the way it should, probably because of the element of the supernatural, in my guess. And well, eco-criticism from ecology, which is a scientific discipline, which originates from biology, is based on scientific discipline. And for scientifically minded people, the word supernatural is not really welcome. Now, I must say on this occasion that supernatural is not just the ancestral spirit and spirit beings, but anything that is, I think, transcendent and immanent, something like space and time, for example. They are supernatural entities, if you like. In fact, if you look at the history, like this tradition of worshiping, space-time as God himself. So the supernatural should be understood in a broader sense in the context of the Indian Tiṇai theory, and that's not probably the case. And that could be one of the reasons why, this is really not acceptable to the larger, world at large, if you like. And one, problem that, Indian eco-criticism has with the Western eco-criticism is the concept of the environment. Now, in her introduction, Glotfelty herself points out how environment is a problematic concept, which is both anthropocentric and dualistic. And in spite of that, American ecocriticism wants to base itself on the concept of environment, doesn't want to give it up. And that is not really acceptable to Indian ecocriticism. So that's another reason why, this divergence, and I think the twain probably shall never meet.
Very good, very good.
Right.
Yeah, that's really very rich. Maybe we can get. So I think we have just a few more minutes, and I would like to hear you. And again, these are things which I've already been talking about. So this might be just an opportunity for you to sort of focus and condense and give us some concluding thoughts, if you like. But concluding thoughts in the sense of the past, present, and future of Tiṇai, right? So there is this past, which is to be found in certain classical Tamil texts, which has been read pretty continuously, I would say, for at least 150 years, very intensely for at least 150 years, but of course, before that as well. And there is a certain kind of a present which you are engaged in through your own activities to try and bring forward a neo-tiNai orientation. But what about the future of Tiṇai? I mean, what is it that, I don't know how broad you want to go with that or how focused you want to be, but maybe you can take a few minutes to tell us about what you are imagining as the future for Tiṇai.
Thank you very much, Shankar. Now, these Tiṇai-like societies, I think they existed all over the world before the state society superseded them. And even after the emergence of the state society, these societies continue to exist in some parts of the world. And as you know, the state societies inseparably related to domestication of animals, deforestation for intensive agriculture, and human settlement, the rise of civilizations, now all of which followed hard on the heels of the Holocene some 10,000 years ago. So anthropologically, these state societies were preceded by the societies of the hunter-gatherers and the horticulturists. So that society which preceded the Holocene, I would like to call the Tiṇai-cene, because the Tiṇai-like societies, existed at that point in time. The time period between the Industrial Revolution and now is what scientists call the Anthropocene, or an epoch of the human, because the humans have had the greatest impact, on the planet. Now, I beg to kind of differ with the definition of the Anthropocene, the generally accepted definition of the Anthropocene, because in my opinion, the Anthropocene actually commences with the rise of the state society itself, because it's not the degree of the impact probably which we need to base our idea of the Anthropocene on, but the kind of cause, the cause of the impact. So if you look at the cause of the impact, I think in my view, as I told you earlier, it is the uniaxial dominance of humans over other humans. I mean, I'm thinking of caste, Dalit issue, all of those male-female oppression, all of that, and humans, dominating the non-human world. So that, I think, is the real cause of the Anthropocene. And if that is the cause, then the Anthropocene commences with the rise of the state society itself. So if we want to usher in a Tiṇai social order, alternative social order to be Tiṇai, then we need to end this Anthropocene. Well, the Holocene, the Pleistocene was ended by an ice age. And well, even if another ice age is there and ends this Anthropocene, I'm not too sure whether the real neo-tiNai-cene, which I want to see, will emerge. I'm just saying that because, I'm just comparing the pre-lockdown and the post-lockdown COVID scenario. Because when we locked down, I actually thought that, after the lockdown, it will be a very changed world. Well, it'll be a very small world because we were all confined to our homes. And, people are talking about self-reliance and all of that, the ecosystem and all that. But very soon, the whole picture changes. And now we know that the post-lockdown probably is going to be worse than the pre-lockdown. So I don't think an ice age will really end the Anthropocene and usher in a neo-tiNai. But what we need is a change of heart. And well, when I say that, I'm really not thinking of Tiṇai landscape of individual conversions and politics here and there, but we need a collective, social change, and that can be only out of a political will, a socio-political will, if you like. And there is very good demonstration of such political will. Well, ask anybody who had lived in the 1970s in India. They would have never thought that, an India of 1991 will ever be born. Okay, all of that agriculture and emphasis on rural industries, all that, kind of took the back seat, and India, adopting the new economic policy, globalized in a very big way and corporatized everything, and putting all of that, earlier Gandhian kind of India, at the back of, everybody's minds. So that kind of change was possible. And how was it possible? I mean, by political will, a socio-political will. And look at, the Bhutanese gross national happiness concept, which, that's a very fanciful idea. I mean, talk about quantifying happiness, that's really scandalous. But then it didn't happen. It did happen. And in about 3 decades, even the UN adopted, that idea for formulating their own idea of human development. So I think it's sheer political will which can make, miracles happen. And when a miracle is likely to happen, there must be a blueprint of an alternative social order. One needs to know what kind of a future we want. And it is, something should be ready to hand for people to forge a new world. And that's what I'm engaged in.
I think that's an extremely wonderful point maybe to end on. I think that you've given us a lot to think about, a lot of different ideas. I hope we've been able to go through this conversation in a somewhat, in a way which will enable people who have not read your work to enter into the conversation. I want to emphasize the intentionality, the sort of willed activity with which you end. And I'm going to turn it over to Karthikeya because he knows what happens next.
Shankar, I'm sorry to interrupt here. Can I just have a word? I just want to thank a few people.
Sure, of course. Karthikeya is in charge, and he will tell us whether you have a word or 3 words or 200,000 words.
Sure, sir. Please go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Karthikeya. I just want to thank Madras Christian College for accommodating Tiṇai courses on their curriculum, for providing space for all the activities of our discussion groups and Tiṇai group. To the late Mr. K. Venkatachalam, Dr. Arivude Nambi, Mr. Watson Solomon, Mr. T. M. Mugundan, J.T.K. Daniel, for being very supportive in all the Tiṇai endeavors. And I also want to thank Dr. Raisin for adding 2 more subgroups to Tiṇai, the Muduga Kurumba Research Center and the Tiṇai Eco Film Festival. And there are several others who have contributed to the growth of this movement in countless ways, and I'm extremely grateful to them. Finally, I also want to thank my own grandparents and parents and my wife Rukmani, my children Pardini and Madini for putting up with all of the turbulence that I caused by my Tiṇai experiment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, sir. Thank you. That was such an enthralling conversation and gave us so much to think about and talk about. And many of the people have been typing in questions in the chat box. We thought we'll just take a break for a few minutes, 4 or 5 minutes, and then we'll reconvene for a question answer session. In the meanwhile, those of you who've noted down your questions, we already have a few questions on the chat box, but the rest of you who might have questions can put them in and we'll take them up one by one. We'll reconvene in a few minutes. Just a small request for everybody in the audience to stay muted and keep their videos off, and you can type in your questions in the chat window. Shall we start, Professor?
Yes, sure.
Okay. So one of the questions from Thanga Velu is that Tinai is clearly mentioned only in Tamil literature. When was it converted into the land way of segregation? I mean, that's one of the questions that he's asking. Or was it already like that? And you spoke about this in your conversation with Professor Shankar, that it is conventionally understood as uh, a literary criticism kind of a device. I think the question is how when was it start? When did it start getting appreciated as a philosophy of biomes and ecosystems, or was it already like that?
Thank you so much for that question, Mr. Thangavelu. Tolkappiyam clearly says that the entire Earth's surface was divided into Tiṇai. So, Mayon Meya Kadurai Vulagamum, Cheyon Meya Maivarai Vulagamum, Vulagamum, and also Padidire Vayam Pathiya Pandey. So, those, instances clearly show that, they were talking about the Earth's surface that was divided into these biome-like structures, not exactly biome, but biome-like, divisions. So that was, actually Tolkappiyam does not introduce this. He's just repeating, the idea or the theory that existed before him. So we really don't know when, this happened, when Tiṇai was, when the land surface was thought of as in terms of Tiṇai. Yeah. Does that answer the question?
Yes. So the next question, sir, is from Samidha Shikha. And she wishes for you to elaborate on what is so special about the Tiṇai social order in the present times vis-a-vis the existing ones, and how would it be more useful?
Okay. First of all, I was talking about the Anthropocene. Now, the Anthropocene clearly says that, the industrial social order has failed us. And I try to argue that not only the industrial social order, even, the earlier agricultural pre-industrial social order had also failed us. So we are looking for an alternative society. That's what a lot of people are, engaged with, not just me. But I told you, some people imagine it in a religious way, some in a secular way, some are writing utopian texts and all of that. So it's a general question. Also because, that life way, Tiṇai-like life way has the longest history. I think it's 80,000 years of hunter-gatherers, and horticulturists, whereas, the state society hardly 10,000 years and industrial society hardly 400 years. So, if time is one of your criteria, in my opinion, that's not the criterion. I really base it on. Mine is, as I told you earlier, told Shankar, it's really the uniaxial kind of dominance, which is the, basic problem, I have with the state society and the industrialized state society. So we are looking for a new kind of relationship, with other humans and non-humans. And what can give us? What social order can give us? Tell me. So in my view, only Tiṇai can. Now, people like, for example, if you've read Jared Diamond, many scholars probably don't respect him as a great author, but I think, he makes a lot of sense when he says, we need to learn a lot from what people usually call the primitive societies. I hate to use that word, but, for example, raising children, respect for elders, being healthy, how to spend your leisure time, how to settle disputes. If you're looking for models, like how to really deal with these social issues, Jared Diamond says, well, go to those people, you call the tribal people. They do it the best. And you're talking about diversity, like cultural diversity or bioregional diversity. I mean, who have been the best guardians of diversity in a human history? Thank you very much, Professor Shikha, for that wonderful question.
A question from Anindya Sinha. He's asking, how does ТиНai envisage the other than human and consciously avoiding the word non-human in terms of their own individual spaces, decisions, politics, life works?
Can you say that again? I don't know whether I fully understood it.
How ТиНai envisages the other than human in terms of their own individual spaces, decisions, politics, life worlds.
Yeah, thank you very much for that question. But I have a problem with the latter part of that question, with their individual spaces and so on. There is no such idea. One thing that did not come up in my conversation with Professor Shankar was the philosophical anthropology of ТиНai. You know, in ТиНai, you don't have an individual human or any being for that matter. We are only, you know, communitarian beings, whether we are humans or non-humans. So that way, this idea of what you call the liberal, you know, humanist subject that we have all grown up with, and which is the basis. I mean, liberal humanism a later thing, but then idea of the individual, which forms the basis of our ideas of democracy, of republic, of nation, of even human rights. Okay, all of these notions are not at all acceptable. I mean, they are completely contrary to, you know, the ТиНai idea of a human and also the non-human. But if you are asking about, you know, how are they presented, I'm telling you, there is a song, you know, a Neidal ТиNai song, in which girl, I mean, tells her boyfriend when he's trying to court her under the shade of an Indian laurel tree, Tiṇai tree, which is in abundance in these coastal areas. Now she tells this boy, come on, I mean, why don't we move away from this shade? Can we go? I mean, there's plenty of shade, you know, elsewhere. Why don't we go there? And, you know, this boy asks, why? Why should we go? And then she says, well, this tree that you're standing under is actually my sister. My mother, you know, raised it with such affection, giving the best of food, you know, to that tree. So I'm really embarrassed, you know, to be under this tree with you. So you can see how, you know, this is not really poetic device, okay? It's not a metaphor here, as you would normally, you know, interpret, you know, in text. In ТиНai societies, I mean, the tree was really a family. It was part of a family. And about that, you know, I have written extensively, and that tradition still continues, you know, in Kerala and Kanyakumari. Shankar rightly said Kanyakumari and Tirunelveli are strange places. I mean, quite unlike the rest of Tamil Nadu. Well, my own family, you know, is called Puliyamuttu Tata Veedu. That's our household. I mean, our household is known by the tree under which, you know, my ancestors lived. And that's a very strong tradition in Kerala also. So they not because, you know, just a tree there, but they believed, you know, that the ancestral spirits from their families, you know, resided in that tree. So nobody touched that tree really. They really respected it and worshipped it. So that is the place of the non-human, if you like.
Yes. Thank you. The next question is from Soumya, and she asks that eco-criticism scholars prefer eco over enviro, as in the latter, as the latter is an anthropocentric prefix. Given that, don't you think that the word, and here she's written the Tamil word for environment, I think sutrachural, if I'm pronouncing it right, I might not
Yeah,
be.
you're almost there, Karthikeya.
Given that, don't you think that the word sutrachural as state society's othering of nature?
The word chituchural, I didn't get you the last part of the question.
As state society's othering of nature.
Mhm. No, the word chuttuchulal is not acceptable to me at all. I never use that word. When I speak about Tiṇai in Tamil or eco-criticism in Tamil, I would like to use the word Tiṇai. I mean, eco-criticism is all about Tiṇai, and Tiṇai is the equivalent of oikos. I mean, it's not exact equivalent, but somewhat, I mean, equivalent. I mean, a near approximate equivalent, you might say. So I want to just abandon that word chuttuchulal. But when you are compelled to use it because only then people understand what you're talking about, I might use it. But I mean, I really don't think that anyway, helps kind of promote the idea of eco-criticism that I'm talking about. So enviro, I mean, oikos is much better than environment, or when you say enviro or oiko is definitely better. But then the word oikos is not interpreted the way it should be interpreted. I mean, when Heckel glossed it, he used the word, I think, Umgebenden Außenwald or something, German word, which was translated into English as environment, unfortunately, and taking, eco-criticism far away from where it should be. So if oikos means something like Tiṇai, then the prefix, oiko is better. In fact, in many European languages like German, they say it much, I mean, their pronunciation is closer to the Greek, because they would call ecology, what you call ecology, with a different vowel like E, it's oikology. So the oiko, that prefix is still there in its sort of more Greek-like form in those languages. No, that doesn't mean that I prefer oikos to Tiṇai. No, not at all. But when I have to speak in English, sometimes it makes sense to use the word oikos to me, communicate to people what I mean by Tiṇai. But otherwise, I would really go with Tiṇai if people can understand what Tiṇai is really all about. Thank you.
Prakash Venkateshan asks if you could define what neo-tiNai poetics means.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, Tiṇai poetics is the poetics that you find in Tolkapiam, the poetics based on Tiṇai. And that has been used a lot by commentators to interpret the Sangam's text. Now that theory is not really very much applicable because these state societies have completely disrupted, the ancient world, particularly, what's the problem of ecological integrity as such. So everything has changed and nothing is in its place right now. So we cannot use Tiṇai criticism as such in the case of, texts or social practices that come from state societies. So that is why I was forced to forge a new text. The ancient Tiṇai theory, I distinguish that with the prefix neo to show that this is not what you find in the earlier texts. Yeah, thank you.
Jaya Darini asks, Tiṇai is discussed in spatial terms, that is eco-regions. Is there a scope for Tiṇai to be discussed in temporal terms?
Well, even in physics, space and time cannot be separated. In fact, many people would write, when they have to write these words, they will hyphenate these words. I'm also now, beginning to hyphenate place-time as place-time. If there is place, there is time. Okay? So you cannot really separate the two. And both together, constitute the mudal. So you cannot talk about real temporal Tiṇai, which is distinct from a spatial Tiṇai. There's no such thing. And one of my, problems with A.K. Ramanujan's interpretation of Tiṇai, and Shankar slightly mentioned that, is to interiorize, Tiṇai. I'm not for that. Tiṇai is not a mental phenomenon. well, a lot of things in the imagination and all of that. I mean, unless you understand what it is, you really don't know what it is, and you can't relate to the other humans and non-humans better. All of that is true. But Tiṇai itself, is very, very place-time oriented thing. And if you want to talk about Tiṇai only in terms of time, then that will not be Tiṇai at all. Thank you.
Mangala Varshini asks if agriculture is a form of dominance in Tiṇai.
Yes, I think so, because that's monoculture. And also, all of the methane pollution due to agriculture. India is one of the, largest, methane, I mean, creators of the methane problem in the world because of the large number of cattle that we have, which is absolutely essential for agriculture. I mean, agriculture in a very primitive form, just planting is one thing, I mean, in the form of horticulture, shall we say. But then when you're talking about intense agriculture, irrigated agriculture, I mean, that's really monoculture, and that's certainly one of the characteristic features of the state society, and that is not congenial for Tiṇai at all.
I think you answered this in a way just
Hello?
now, but I will just ask this question. This is from Karni Bhati, and they're asking if whether it would be right to think of Tiṇai as a concept that refers to holistic way of being, which went with or produced a certain kind of subjectivity. In alternative words, can it be seen as a certain way of thinking or a tacit understanding of selfhood that, alas, has gone out of our modern ways of thinking?
Well, I was saying a little bit about the philosophical anthropology of Tiṇai. I mean, what I mean by that big word is how the human, is theorized, is conceptualized. Okay? Now, that's what I mean by philosophical anthropology. Not really anthropology as such, but anthropology works here in a different sense, a study of human in that sense. So, if you look at that philosophical anthropology, then you probably want to talk about the Tanmai, Munnilai, and Padarkai, I mean, roughly translated agent, patient, and context. Tanmai as the agent and patient as Munnilai as the patient and Padarkai as the context. So it is, the confluence, the coming together of these three. I mean, that is where, the community of being occurs. So everyone, like you or me, is a community. We are not just an agent. I mean, agent is actually all these three are, if you like, personae, not persons as such. So they are roles rather than individuated psychosomatic entities as such. So talking about the selfhood in the fashion that you are, I think it sort of is not compatible with the kind of thinking, that Tiṇai exhorts you to. So, this is something that we need to keep in mind. Tiṇai asks you to think radically new, like an entirely different way, shake off much of the baggage that we have, inherited from the West, starting from Plato onwards. I think all of us, who has gone to the universities, schools, we have all kind of ideas of everything about human beings and other beings and our society, our family, all of these are all shaped by those ideas, and these ideas are sometimes assumptions. Assumptions are not often available to you for criticism. They kind of there at the back of your what you're saying, a statement or a question, and then you need to critique that well, in order to kind of ask a different kind of a question. So I'm sorry to say this, but then this is where we get when we talk about, such things like selfhood. and so on. So there is no selfhood as such. I mean, if you like, if you want me to put it that way, in Tiṇai. In Tiṇai, we have only a community, and how we all work together as a community. You know, that's what I just probably want to cite. An incident here. Recently, I read a story in the Tamil newspaper about how the villagers were willing to kind of switch off their street lights for a few days. They did that because they found that in the switch box of the street lamp and that post, a bird was nesting. It found that spot very unusually as a beautiful, proper nesting site for her. So she nested there and had some young ones there. And these villagers, for fear of disturbing the bird, they just kind of were willing to go without the light for a few days. Now this is kind of as idea of human, is what I'm trying to talk about. So you define yourself in terms of something else, which is not you. I mean, well, even that I need to correct myself, because I'm already saying you and I and all that. These are all kind of, necessary fictions to communicate an idea. Okay, so if I'm trying to successfully communicate myself, I'm trying to say that I come into being as a community, okay, not as an individuated entity.
Right. I think we would not have time for more questions. Would you like to take one more as a last question, sir?
Sure.
Okay. Gomati LS asks, how far was the concept of, can the concept of Tiṇai be seen in subsequent temple-centered society of Tamilakam?
Can be what? I didn't get.
How far can the concept of Tiṇai be seen in the subsequent temple-centered society of Tamilakam?
Right. Thank you for that question. Well, I don't use the word religion in the context of Tiṇai, because when we speak about religion, we are talking about an institution. So institutionalized spirituality, if you like. No, we don't find that sort of a thing in Tiṇai at all. I mean, Tiṇai is a very spiritual entity in society, but it is not associated with any religion as such. And a temple that you're talking about is very much a part of that kind of a religious institution. And that is another characteristic of a state society. So it is only in a state society that you find spirituality become religious institutions. And it's really not compatible with Tiṇai at all. Thank you very much for that question.
Thank you everyone. I think there are maybe a couple of more questions. What we can try and do is that we can, we have all your email addresses, and we will take a note of your questions, perhaps send them to Professor Selvamony, and if there's an opportunity, then, maybe he can respond over email. Would that?
Sure.
Yeah. So
great. Thank you, Sahapedia, and thank you, Shankar, for taking time off.
Yeah, I just like to thank both
Thank you all listeners
and Professor Selvamony, Professor Shankar for interviewing and drawing out Professor Selvamony's work as only a committed student and a careful reader of his work would have done. And Professor Selvamony was such a educative and interesting lecture that as you said, we need to develop these blueprints and models for that can kind of show us a way out of the conundrum that we are in right now, in terms of our problems with modern society, etc. And it's so valuable, the kind of work that you've done all your life, and it was such an education to kind of get to hear about it. So thank you so much for agreeing.
You're welcome. I enjoyed it myself.
Thank you everybody in the audience for tuning in today, and we will be posting a recording of this talk later. And like I said, if some of your questions were not answered, we will try to get them answered over email. Thank you.